I'm back with Carol Coventry, who just read a very fun and mathematical excerpt from Counting on Love. So I just adore being in the headset of Georgiana, who finds it fun to do accounts and is lusting over her math as much as she's lusting over Reginald. And it just occurred to me that they didn't have calculators in the Regency, and how on earth does
Yeah.
anyone handle that? So I guess I'd like to start by finding out. I know that, as Susan Coventry, you write historical fiction. And
Mhm.
so, what is your approach to research when you approach historical romance? And did you, for example, go down a rabbit hole on do they have calculators?
So, yeah, I always, for both the historical fiction and the historical romance, I always way over research and spend far too much time doing it. I love the research aspects. And I think with historical romance, more so than with historical fiction, the trick is leaving most of that out. When I started with the historical romance, I got most of my feel for it by just reading other historical romances. And it wasn't until, so I felt like I had a framework for it, but it wasn't until I start writing that I go, oh, I need to know this or I need to know that. And then I would really dig into the research.
Yeah. And so you were researching as you were writing, and what is your personal approach to the tightrope of historical accuracy versus telling a fun story?
I really want to be as accurate as possible. There are times when your research doesn't really bear out what you think you knew. And then it's tough to go with, well, if everybody thinks this, should I just stick with this or should I throw this loop in there that goes, well, I have some actual research that I'm never going to be able to explain to you, but that I know that this is right. So that's kind of where I find the tightrope to walk is when to go with your gut versus what you just read.
Do you have an example of that?
One of the examples would be when the London season would occur. And most often we think, well, it starts in the spring and runs through the summer. And that makes it a lot nicer than to imagine people slogging through the wet and the snow. But when I was looking at, okay, so when did it start and when does it end? And it was more variable than that. And kind of earlier from my understanding, earlier on in the Regency period, it was not as set as it was later on in the Victorian period. And it really corresponded with when Parliament was in session, because that's when all the lords and ladies had to come back into London to be there for Parliament. And so that's when they would have their parties. So sometimes it would happen over the winter. They would be there in the winter. And so then I looked up when was Parliament in session during this, 1812, 1813, and they were in session over the winter time. So I had the season start in the winter, which was difficult because then you are picturing them slogging about in the mud. So
Yeah, I've run into that as well, where it's like, wait a second, I have this idea of the season as a concept, and then when you match up the dates, it's like, oh.
mhm.
Also, like if it's really hot, like weren't they leaving, and was everyone there? It is interesting to match up the historical texts with the genre texts.
Mhm.